Today, let's walk through the steps of how you can make your own heatless curler set. Welcome, I do sewing and DIY related content, and if you've been anywhere on social media, I feel like especially in the past year or so, everyone's talking about heatless curlers, and I decided I wanted to try to make my own. Now for this, you are going to want silky or satiny material, and you're going to want three pieces. So two are going to be for scrunchies, and then one is going to be for that long tube. In addition, you are going to want some sort of cording. Now, I originally was going to try to use this extra cording I had on hand, but for the tube itself, you're going to need a piece that's around 36 inches by 4 inches. So I opted for batting as I had a lot more of that, and I found that I could just roll this up into the tube shape that I would like. And I'll include all those dimensions below for what I use for the scrunchies as well as the tube for the fabric. Once you have all of this cut out though, we are then ready to begin on making our heatless curlers. You will want some elastic for your scrunchie too. Now for the tube for this batting, I'm going to just kind of wrap this up a little bit, and then I'm going to be taking the satin that will be used for the tube part, and I'm just going to wrap it over top, and then I'm going to be using a quilting clip to hold this in place just because it is kind of a lot of material. Now, one thing that will come up, I saw a lot of people doing the tutorial this way, which was why I had started doing it. You'll see at the end that you do kind of get a little bit of a funny result, but it all works out. So if you had wanted to do this without putting that cording in the middle, you definitely could have and just had your big tube and just match it with right sides together all the way through. So now I'm just going to be taking my seam all the way through. You see we have a giant tube right now, it looks a little funny, but I'm just making that one seam all the way down, and then I'm leaving one of the ends open. Now, in addition, I am going to prep my scrunchie, so this is very similar to how we've made all the other scrunchies if you watched any of those on my channel. I do have a whole pattern available on how to sew scrunchies too, but basically we're just going to be sewing from that one quilting clip all the way to the other, leaving a 1-inch gap on either side. And then I will be repeating this for the second scrunchie. These are going to be used to hold our hair in place on the tube. Once you have all of this done though, you can go to your sewing machine and begin sewing. So I'm going to start sewing with the scrunchie just to get this out of the way. So again, being sure to start about an inch and a half down, and then just taking my time and sewing all of that up. Now, because this is silky material, be sure you are using a thinner needle so that you aren't snagging your material. Then I'm going to repeat this for the second scrunchie as well. Now it's going to be for the tube. So for the tube, I'm actually going to be using a zipper foot because it'll be a little easier to work around all of that cording. So I'm just installing my zipper foot, and then I'm going to get the big tube that we have created, and I'm just going to begin the sewing process for it. Now, all of the things I saw online were talking about like how you wanted to sew this one short edge and then you pivot your fabric and sew all the way down. The big thing that I would recommend with this, if you're doing it this method, is just be sure you're not catching any of that cording in your seam. Thankfully, I did not, but I could see how that could be a little challenging, so definitely take your time and be sure not to catch any of the cording. Next up, because this is satin, I'm going to go through with my pinking shears and just trim this so that I help make sure that it doesn't unravel at any point. And then you can turn this right side out. So for the cord, it's pretty easy to turn this right side out, which I think is why people do it this way, is all you have to do is just pull that cording out and it turns right side out for you, especially since it is so silky and smooth. Then you will need to cut that off. I at first thought I messed up, but basically just when you cut this from that original cording, and then you will be taking a safety pin onto the one edge and pushing it back through. So that was really just a little hack so that you could turn this right side out a lot easier. And again, it's up to you if you want to go that way or if you want to kind of do it in two separate steps where you're just sewing up the tube and then placing the cording back inside. Because it is that nice silky satiny material, it's going to be pretty easy to work through. When you are doing this, just be careful not to pop any stitches along the way. You really want to take your time and do it nice and slowly. So here is what my tube looks like. I now have all that cording all the way through, or my batting. So what I'm going to do is just trim off any of this extra that is on either end, and then I'm going to be folding in the satiny edges together so that I get a nice and clean looking seam, and then I'm just going to be hand stitching that closed. So once I have it folded in, I'm just going to be taking a quilting clip, putting it on top to hold it in place, and then I would just be hand sewing across both of these edges so that this tube is actually complete. So as you can tell, this tube was really easy to make. You have this nice satiny tube, and then I'm just going to go through using a needle and thread and just hand stitch this up. So once you have both those sewn, you can actually set them aside, and now it is time for us to work on our scrunchie. So I did the same thing with my pinking shears for that seam just to clean it up. And then I'm going to be adding a safety pin onto the one edge and pushing that through the scrunchie tube so I can turn this right side out. And you're going to be repeating that for both of your scrunchie tubes. You just want to turn these right side out so then we can begin the next step. Once it's turned, you're then going to be matching those short ends with right sides together. So this can be a little bit challenging just because it is such a small area, but you're just going to be matching with right sides together and then using pins or quilting clips to hold in place and taking a seam all the way around. That's going to give you that tube that we'll use for our scrunchie. Once you have this complete for both of those scrunchies, you're just going to take that seam all the way through. I really like to pivot my fabric as I go through this to make sure that I'm not catching any material underneath. And this is what my scrunchie tube now looks like. So I have this completed for both scrunchies, so now it is time for us to add the elastic. Now I'm using a 1/4 inch elastic here, and then I have my safety pin. It's around 7 to 8 inches long for the piece of elastic, and I'm just going to be inserting this into the scrunchie tube now, very carefully going through, being sure that I also note the other end of the elastic so that I make sure that I don't miss it. You want to keep the other end out so that we can match these together as we go through. So once I get to a point where I'm good with that little edge of the elastic, I'm going to pin that to the scrunchie and then just keeping working the other end of the scrunchie all the way through. And here is what it looks like. So now I'm just going to sew both of those edges of elastic together. I like to go back and forth about 6 or 7 times just to make sure it is nice and secure. And then I'm going to trim off some of that extra little bit of elastic, put it back into the scrunchie tube, and now all we have to do is basically sew up that little opening. So I like to do a hand stitch. You could definitely use your machine if you wanted to, but once you go through and sew that up, then your scrunchie is complete, and you can follow those exact same steps for the other scrunchie. Again, if you want even more in-depth review on how to sew a scrunchie, I have multiple videos and I'll link them below. Here are my heatless curlers though, so you have the tube and then you have the 2 scrunchies. The idea is you wrap your damp hair around the tube and then you wait anywhere from 3 hours to overnight, and then those scrunchies are holding the edges of your hair. I did try this out on my hair and I was able to get it all set up, but I ran out of time and it didn't have enough time to set, so I didn't see what it looks like yet, but that's the general idea. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe and let me know what you want to see next. Thanks for watching.